One way to end a friendship with someone is to go on holiday together with them sometimes. You live with them and you discover who they really are. I think that happened. Julie and I went away with another couple some years ago, and there was no dramatic arguments or fights. We just found out a little bit more about who they really were, and we didn't like it. They probably found out about us and didn't like it either, but we didn't see so much of them after that. Why is there an Old Testament in our Bibles? What was going on there? Well, Israel was getting the opportunity to know their Creator by living with him in a close covenant relationship. And it didn't all go well. They didn't like some of the things that they discovered, although the problem, of course, was not theirs. The problem was theirs rather than God's problem. And in today's passage, we see Israel getting to know her God better. And it leads to joy, but it also leads to mourning. Israel finds God difficult, and they're left perplexed. In chapter 6, verse 20, they say, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God?" How are we going to live in the presence of a God like this? And it's not just them, it's not just Israel, because throughout the Old Testament, through Israel, the whole world is discovering what God is like. So, for example, the way that God brought his people out of Egypt was not just showing them what he was like, but was showing Pharaoh and the Egyptians what God was like. And actually, more than that, because the news spread, so that by the time God's people arrived in the promised land, the people there had already heard about their God and what he'd done for them. So why do we need the Old Testament? Well, one reason why we need it would be so that we get to know God better, our Creator and their Creator. Because the Old Testament God is not a different God from the God of the New Testament. His name, as he reveals it, means I am. And one of the senses of that is, well, I am who I am. I don't change. I am. And so who is God? Who is this Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah? Who is he? And what does it mean that he is the holy God? That was a big question for Israel then, and it's a big question for us. Who is the Lord? The Lord is holy. He is like no other. He is a dangerous enemy, but he's also a dangerous friend. First of all then, who is the Lord? He has no rivals. Look again at the start of 1 Samuel 5 on page 275. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. This is continuing the story of what we heard about 2 weeks ago. And if you remember, we heard about how the Philistines had established themselves along the Mediterranean coast in what we would now call the Gaza Strip and in the area north of that. And they began to threaten Israel. And so in chapter 4, we see Israel going out to fight against them. And Israel is defeated. 4,000 of them are killed. And they decide, well, we need to go again, but this time we will take the ark of God, the Lord's box. We'll take it from the temple, from the tabernacle, we'll take it into battle, and they thought that would give them success. But an even greater defeat was what happened. 30,000 of them were killed. The ark of God was captured by the Philistines. Priests were killed. It was a disaster for the nation. If you look at chapter 4, verse 21, this is Eli, the priest's daughter-in-law, is dying as she's giving birth. And she names the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel." So it's a real low point in Israel's life. Everything, if you like, has gone wrong. the glory, God's glory, has left their land. The ark has been captured. And the Philistines took the ark to Ashdod, a place on the coast that still exists today, and they took it into the temple of their god Dagon. Why would they do that? Well, because in their minds, their god Dagon has just triumphed over the God of the Israelites, Yahweh. And so they bring the spoils, they bring this trophy of the victory into Dagon's temple. There they have an image, an idol of Dagon. They might have thought it strange that the Israelites have no idol, but they've got this box, and that seems to be the nearest thing, so that will do. It's being put there for the worshippers. As they come to worship the great god Dagon, they will see his enemies right there at his feet. And it's there for the world, for whoever's going to listen. If anyone asks, where now is the ark of the God of Israel? The answer is, it's in Dagon's temple. Yahweh is a bit of a has-been. Our god Dagon has triumphed. Just before we look at what happened, it's worth asking this question. Did the Philistines and other peoples of that time, in that ancient world, did they think that their idol of wood or stone or metal, did they think that was actually the God that they worshipped? They must have known that a craftsman had made these things, and although they were wrong about who to worship, they were not unintelligent people. So I think it's clear, and those who've studied it would say they knew that this was a representation of their God, an image of their God, but most of them seem to have believed that the idol was more than just a representation. In some way, the spirit God who they worship lived within this idol, spiritually rather than physically. In some way, this idol is the earthly life of the God, the means for him to transmit his power into the world. Some thought that the God they were worshipping could only see the world through the idol. So if you came into the presence of the idol, your God could see you. If you were elsewhere, maybe he couldn't. So those kind of ideas, I think, about what their idols were. And the Bible tells us that idols are indeed more than just lifeless images, because the Bible says those who worship them are worshipping demons, whether that's knowingly or unknowingly. Those who sacrifice to idols are sacrificing to demons. You'd find that in various places in the Old Testament, including Psalm 106. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. The Israelites, of course, had the Ten Commandments, and the second commandment was, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. So, no idols for them, no image, but they did have this box, the Ark of the Lord, a box that contained words, the Ten Commandments, as received by Moses, were in there. In some places it seems to suggest that maybe the jar of manna and Aaron's staff were in there. So you've got the words of God and things representing the mighty deeds or acts of God. This box is therefore a reminder of who God is and what he said. It's called, in chapter 4, verse 3, the Ark of the Lord's Covenant. And in the next verse, it's called the throne. It is the throne of the Lord of hosts. It's, as well as being a box, it's a seat, if you like, a chair for God. And therefore to bring the box is to bring the throne, and therefore in some sense is to bring God. As Ali said 2 weeks ago, the Lord is everywhere, that's true, but yet the Lord chooses to be present, enthroned on his ark in his temple. And so when that ark arrives in the Israelite camp, the Philistines are terrified. Chapter 4, verse 7, a god has come into the camp. We're in trouble. And now they've captured that ark, they bring it into the temple of their god Dagon. And what happens? Verse 3, When the people of Ashdod arose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. The idol has fallen over, but symbolically, Dagon has now fallen down in worship in front of the throne of Yahweh, the God of Israel. This is not what they expected. They thought that they were bringing the ark there, if you like, the worship. The God of Israel has been defeated, is now submitting to Dagon, but it's the other way round. This is meant to be humorous in the sense of it's meant to delight the Israelites, those who worship Yahweh, for them to imagine in their minds Dagon falling down before their God. This is meant to delight children as they hear about the things that their God has done. And the people, of course, pick him up. I guess they were a bit embarrassed about all this, and they put him back in his place. But, verse 4, the following morning, the same thing, in fact worse. Dagon fallen on his face, and this time his head and his hands have been broken off. He is destroyed, or at least he's rendered powerless before the Lord. And they are all learning here that the Lord has no rivals. When a team thrashes every other team in the league, we say there was no competition. Well, actually, of course, there was competition. But what we mean is that all the competition was so vastly inferior that, in effect, there was no competition. When we read in the Bible there are no other gods, well, there were other gods. There were gods that people were worshipping, but in a sense, there are no other gods because those gods are not gods. There are no rivals. They are so vastly inferior to the Lord, the Creator, the God of Israel, the true God. So they think they've captured Yahweh, but he's not captured. He's still sovereign. He's free to act. He brings Dagon down before him. Just because his people are defeated doesn't mean that he is defeated. In fact, what this points to is that the Lord must have been displeased with his people and acting in judgment of them. Given that he's still clearly powerful, how else was it possible for them to be defeated and for the ark to be taken captive? The Lord was behind all of that. The Lord has no rivals. We're constantly tempted to worship gods that are no gods, the rivals, whether that's money and wealth or sexual pleasure or our thinking that we have freedom and we can do as we like, or the desire to make a name for ourselves. I can't remember who it was, but I read in the paper this week about someone who said his great fear was waking up and finding that he was now a has-been. You know, his life was so tied to who people thought he was. And those are just some of the gods that we worship. We look to them to satisfy ourselves. We make great sacrifices to them. We think they're going to have the answer, the thing that we're missing in life. But our gods are like Dagon. They will all fall on their faces before the Lord. The gods we worship are powerless. They're laughable. In fact, if only we could see how foolish this is, it would be a great help to us. We would say, what am I doing worshipping a God like this who has no power to help me or satisfy me? Dagon then is humiliated before the Lord. He lost his hands. They were broken off. But when you look at verse 6, we see the Lord is the one who still has hands. The Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation upon them and afflicted them with tumors. Who is the Lord? He is a dangerous enemy. These people in Ashdod are afflicted with tumors. That word, I don't think we want to tie it down tightly as like a modern medical definition of what we've got here. Some kind of disease that produced some kind of swelling. Later on we read about rats or in some translations, mice, some kind of rodents that are plaguing them as well. Is that a different plague from the tumors? Are they linked? Some people have said, is this some kind of bubonic plague carried by rats producing swellings? I don't think we know. But in some way the Lord afflicted them, and it was deadly. Verse 10 to 12, people are dying because of this. The narrator tells us that it is the Lord, it is Yahweh, it is Jehovah that's doing this. I don't know how long it was before the people realized that. You could imagine the conversation in the pub, talking about this terrible plague. When did it begin? Hang on a minute, wasn't that the same time that the ark arrived in Dagon's temple? Is that just a coincidence? Well, the theory that they are linked is confirmed because they start moving the ark to other places, and wherever they move it, the plague falls on those cities. So in chapter 5, verse 8, it's moved to Gath, and then chapter 5, verse 10, they send it on to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They've brought the ark of the God of Israel round to us to kill us and our people." And eventually, when we get to chapter 6, the Philistine priests advise them to send the ark back to Israel with a guilt offering so that you may be healed. Chapter 6, verse 3. The Philistines then seem to have two questions. One is, what guilt offering should we send? And you may find this bizarre, but verse 4, they're told to send a gift of 5 gold tumors, models of the tumors, and 5 gold rats. Why? Well, it's a guilt offering. They're sending an offering back to the Lord who they've offended in the hope that he will deal kindly with them. And it maybe seems that some are resistant to the idea of sending valuable gold objects to the Israelites, but the priests, the Philistine priests in verse 6, tell them not to harden their hearts. Remember what happened to the Egyptians and Pharaoh when their hearts were hardened. Don't do that. And we have this really surprising turning of the tables. The Philistine priests are preaching to the Philistines about Yahweh, the God of Israel, and saying, don't harden your heart against him, because it didn't go well for others. The other question that's on their mind is it really the God of Israel who has brought this great disaster on them? And that's when we get to the strange little incident with the cows. So from verse 7, chapter 6, verse 7, they get a new cart ready. They get 2 cows that have calved, and they separate the cows from their calves, which I'm told if you go in a field, never get between a cow and its calf. It's not a good thing to do. And they use these cows, they attach these cows to the cart. Now, we know what ought to happen. As soon as you release the cows with the cart, with the ark on it, surely they're going to go straight back to their calves that you've penned up. But they don't. And this comes to them as confirmation that this is the Lord's work. There's another power at work here, because when the cart and the cows are released, verse 12, the cows went straight up towards Beth Shemesh. That was a distance of some 9 miles up the road into Israel. Straight up the road. They did not turn to the right or to the left. The rulers of the Philistines followed them to see what would happen, as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. And now they're in no doubt. It is the Lord who's been doing all of this. He is a dangerous enemy. That's what the Philistines learn. He's still dangerous. Don't think that you could make him your enemy without consequences. Don't think that you can live in his world, breathe his air, eat his food, enjoy his gifts, and not worship him and not serve him without any consequence. When we get to the New Testament, we're warned by Jesus against a simplistic view. We're not to say, oh, because that person has become ill, they must be a worse sinner than me. No. But still, God is a dangerous enemy. Some people have taught what generally gets called universalism. That is the idea that if there is such a place as hell, it must be empty, because God would never send anyone there. Jesus did not teach that. He spoke more than anyone about hell as a reality. He was not afraid to talk about the weeping and gnashing of teeth. He warned against being thrown into hell where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And Jesus said, and you need to enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Is God your enemy because you've made him that by not being willing to serve him and worship him? Well, then don't rest until you are reconciled to him. I think Israel would have been delighted to hear of everything that happened to the Philistines because they had taken the ark of God captive. But the last few verses tell us about a shock that comes to the Israelites when the ark is returned to them. He's not only a dangerous enemy, they discover that he is a dangerous friend. And so, chapter 6, verse 13, the ark arrives back on the cart, pulled by the cows, back into Beth Shemesh in Israel. And there are two responses to that. One of them is joy. That's in verse 13. The harvesters look up and see it and rejoice at the sight. And they make an offering, a sacrifice to the Lord in thanksgiving. And they remove those gold gilt offerings and they set them on a rock, which becomes a permanent testimony or a witness to these events. But alongside the joy, there's also sadness and mourning. If you look on to verse 19. But God struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death, because they'd looked into, or it might be translated, looked at, the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them. And the men of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? This is the ark of the holy God. Israel had been taught that no one was to look into the ark. In fact, no one was to see the ark. It was to be kept in the tabernacle behind a curtain. And the high priest would be the only one who would see it, and he would be carrying blood as an offering for sin. And when they had to move camp, they were taught that without looking at the ark, they were to take the curtain down and put it over the ark, and then a layer of leather, like a cover, so that they carried the ark covered up. No one would see it. The ark then is a reminder of God's holiness, his separateness, his purity, his glory, and would remind them of their sinfulness and the danger to them of this holy God, their need for God's grace if they were to be able to live with this God. You know how radioactive materials need to be kept like in a lead box or in some kind of containment building, and how there have to be rules that keep people safe. Well, that was the way it was with the ark. And so they send the ark on, and this time they set aside a man, Eliezer, to guard it, to look after it carefully. When you get to the New Testament, of course, with the death of Jesus, that curtain in the temple is torn in two. Jesus, by his death, opens the way into the Holy of Holies where God sits on the throne. But it's not that Jesus has removed the holiness of God. Jesus, if you like, is the protective suit that we need. He gives us the clothes, the righteousness, his righteousness, that will enable us to enter into the presence of the Lord without coming to harm. But God is still holy. He's still dangerous if we think we can treat him casually or ignore his commands or despise Christ's sacrifice for us or offend the Spirit who he sends to live in us, his Holy Spirit. When C.S. Lewis was writing the Narnia Chronicles, he chose a lion to be the Christ-like figure in those books. And Aslan in those books is good, and he's kind, and those who trust him love him, and he's everything to them. But, as C.S. Lewis reminds us, he's still dangerous. He's not tame. He's a big cat and not a pussycat. So the Old Testament speaks of judgment on God's enemies for sure, but I think the prophets spend just as much time talking about judgment on Israel when they turn away from God and treat him with contempt. He's a dangerous enemy and he's a dangerous friend. And then Jesus is born as one of us, but he's still the holy God. Jesus reveals God as loving and kind, but not as easygoing. God is still holy and pure and powerful. And when people saw Jesus for who he really was, they were afraid. So think of Peter. He falls at Jesus' knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." I think the New Testament is full of warnings reminding us that God is dangerous, not to encourage us to run away from him, because, to be honest, where would we run? But to warn us not to turn away from him. The book of Hebrews tells us that our Christian worship is worship of a dangerous Lord. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews 12:28. And finally, at the end of the Bible, we have in Revelation that vision of Jesus. One like a son of man. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. And out of his mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Who is the Lord? The Lord is holy. He is like no other. He has no rivals. He is a dangerous enemy. And if we turn away from him, if we are unfaithful to him, a dangerous friend. Fear the Lord and worship him alone. Shall we pray?